The cold came first. It always did at Fort Aldrin, before anything went wrong, before any sound broke the Montana darkness. The cold arrived like a hand pressing against a man's chest from the inside. Captain Frank Dillard had been standing in it for 6 hours. He was 52 years old, a career that had spanned nearly 3 decades. 89 days, until he submitted his retirement paperwork and walked out of the Army for the last time. Fort Aldrin security commander, that was what his orders said: base security, perimeter checks, gate duty, a job given to men who had nowhere left to go. He had known when they gave it to him what it meant. You did not become a security commander at a classified installation in rural Montana because the Army thought highly of your future. You became one because someone, somewhere in a building you would never enter again, had made a quiet decision about you, and the decision was final. He had accepted it. That was what a man did after all those years. He accepted it, and he showed up, and he did the job correctly, because doing the job correctly was the one thing they could not take from him, regardless of what they decided about his rank. 89 days. The base surveillance system had flagged a thermal anomaly at 1:47 hours. A faint heat signature near the eastern perimeter fence. Small, moving. Wrong, not the way a deer moved through scrub brush, not the way wind carried debris across frozen ground. This moved with intention. 3 steps, then a pause, 4 steps, then stillness. Then it appeared somewhere else entirely, as if the frozen ground had simply relocated it without effort or explanation. Dillard called it in. Standard protocol. 2 of his men swept Sector 4 and found nothing. He swept Sector 6 himself and found a single boot print pressed into frost. 1 print, clean tread, the right depth for a person who understood how to distribute weight across a footfall so the earth remembered as little as possible. He did not call it in again. He followed it himself. There was something humiliating about that decision, and he was aware of it. A captain in the final months of a diminished career, alone in the Montana dark, chasing a trace that 2 of his men had already failed to find. He could have handed it off. He could have logged it as inconclusive and let the morning shift take a second look. That was the reasonable thing. That was what a man 3 months from retirement was supposed to do. He kept walking. The trace moved south by 22:30 hours, then west. Then it vanished near the maintenance corridor connecting the armory to the communications annex. He nearly called off the search twice. Both times something in his chest told him to stay with it. He had learned over the years to listen to that sensation, even when it had cost him. It had cost him more than once. The metallic sound reached him at 2:58. Barely a sound at all. A single click, light as a thumbnail pressed against a blade, coming from somewhere in the dark stretch between the motor pool wall and the water reclamation tanks. In warmer weather, ambient equipment noise would have buried it completely, but Montana in February stripped everything down to what was real. The air was still, the cold amplified. Small things. Dillard stopped walking. He stood with his M4A1 raised at a low ready, breathing in measured intervals, watching the darkness between the tanks. His finger lay flat against the trigger guard, not on the trigger. A career in uniform had taught him the difference between what he could see and what he was certain of. Nothing moved. For 40 seconds, nothing moved at all. Then the figure stood up. It rose from a crouch so controlled and precise it barely disturbed the air around it. No sound of clothing against metal, no scrape of boot on concrete. The figure materialized from the shadow beside the nearest water tank as though it had been part of the structure itself, and it stood at full height and it did not run. Dillard pressed his thumb to the weapon light. The beam cut across 20 feet of frozen ground and found a person in dark tactical gear, gloves, balaclava rolled to expose the face from the nose down, a low-profile chest rig carrying equipment he recognized as high tier, the kind issued at levels above his clearance, height around 5'7", build lean and economic, the kind earned through years of physical demands that had nothing to do with fitness culture and everything to do with operational survival. The posture was what stopped him. Hands at the sides, not raised, not reaching for anything. This figure was standing the way someone stood when they had already decided how a moment was going to unfold and were simply waiting for the other party to understand. He advanced 4 steps. He pressed the muzzle of the M4A1 forward, close enough to make the geometry clear. The figure did not move. He swept the weapon light across the chest rig, looking for identification. No name tape, no unit patch, no standard insignia, just bare black nylon. An equipment worn by someone who had carried it for years through conditions that left permanent marks. Then the light caught something on the left wrist, small, nearly hidden beneath the glove cuff, a patch the size of a playing card, pressed flat. He tilted the beam to read it. He had seen that designation exactly once, in a classified briefing 3 years prior. The presenting officer had referenced it in a single sentence and moved past it quickly, the way people moved past things they were not supposed to linger on. Dillard had written nothing down. He had remembered it anyway, because he had spent his career learning which things were worth carrying. His grip on the M4A1 did not loosen, but something in the back of his mind went very, very quiet. The woman standing in front of him said nothing. That was what registered. First, not the gear, not the rifle across her back, the silence. Most people, when facing a firearm at close range, did something, flinched, argued, raised their hands. This figure stood in the February cold as though she had been expecting him, not as a threat but as a development she had already accounted for and was mildly curious about. He said, "Identify yourself." She looked at him for 3 full seconds. When she answered, her voice was low and even, carrying no particular emotion in either direction. "I have been here 4 days, Captain. You are the first one to notice." He processed those words at the speed the cold allowed. The base lights held steady on the perimeter. A distant generator cycled through its automated check and fell silent. The Montana dark pressed close around both of them. 4 days. He did not lower the weapon. "You are going to repeat that." She did not repeat it. Instead, she turned her head and looked at the thermal camera mounted on the corner of the water reclamation building. Then back at him, then at the sensor array along the motor pool wall. She looked at these systems the way an engineer looked at a structure she had designed and built herself. Total familiarity, everything already understood. Every sensor on this base logged its normal cycle for the past 96 hours, she said. No anomaly flags, no alert tier elevations, the trace you found tonight was the first one I allowed through the grid." Dillard kept the muzzle level, allowed. I needed to see who would follow it. He studied her face in the weapon light. The kind of stillness she carried did not come from training alone. It came from years of situations where stillness was the difference between living and not. Her eyes were not afraid of him. They were measuring him the way an experienced operator assessed every element of an environment: threat probability, exit options, the calibration of the man holding the weapon. He said, "Step fully into the light." She stepped forward without hesitation. The beam fell across her and he saw the rifle across her back, an Mk13 Mod 7, suppressed barrel angled. Downward, safety engaged. He recognized it immediately. Not an army weapon, not issued to anyone at his level of the chain. The patch on her wrist told him exactly which branch it belonged to. He lowered the M4A1 4 inches, not all the way, 4 inches, because his instincts and his experience told him the tactical calculation had shifted, and a man who kept a weapon raised past the moment that warranted. It was advertising the limits of his judgment. She said, "We do not have a great deal of time, and I need to ask you something." He waited. 3 years ago, she said, "the supply chain report, you filed it through standard channels. I need to know exactly what you saw." The air between them crystallized. He had not heard anyone reference that report in 3 years, not his commanding officer, not the Inspector General's office, which had acknowledged receipt and sent a form letter 14 days later explaining that the matter had been reviewed and no further action was required. Not Colonel Ward Spence, who had called him into his office 48 hours after the filing and spoken to him for exactly 11 minutes about the importance of choosing one's professional engagements with care. He said, "Who are you?" She did not answer that question. She held his gaze with a patience that was not arrogance and not hostility, the patience of someone holding more information than she was prepared to share in any single moment, who had decided to be deliberate about the sequence. He reached for the radio on his left shoulder. Standard procedure: contact commanding officer when unidentified personnel are discovered on installation. He had done this every time in his career. It was reflex. It was training. It was the documented correct action. Her hand came up before his fingers reached the radio. Not grabbing, not aggressive, simply present, position between his hand and the device with the precise certainty of someone who had rehearsed this contingency. "Not yet," she said. He stopped, not because she had blocked him physically, because her voice, when she said it, carried something his instincts recognized before his mind could name it. Not a threat, the quality of a briefing officer's pause before information is delivered that reclassifies everything before it. She reached into a pouch on her chest rig and removed his radio from his holster. He stared at it. She held it toward him so he could see the back panel. A device the size of a thumbnail was affixed near the battery housing, a signal suppressor, the kind referenced in Tier 1 capability assessments he had read but never seen in operational use. "I placed that 20 minutes before you found me," she said. "You have not been in contact with anyone since 2:38. 20 minutes. He had been within 100 meters of her position 20 minutes ago. He had swept that grid. she had been somewhere inside it, watching him move, and he had passed through without knowing. She worked the device free from the battery housing with the efficient motion of someone disabling something she no longer needed to use. She dropped it into her own chest rig. Then she held his radio out to him. He took it. She said, "You are operational again, but now you know what I can do with 47 seconds and a component the size of my thumbnail." That was the point. He understood. The device had not been about permanently blocking him. It had been about demonstrating the gap between what he assumed was secure and what actually was. She had made her point. She did not need to hold his radio hostage to maintain the advantage she had already established. He exhaled through his nose. The vapor moved sideways in the cold and disappeared. 4 days, he said. Yes. The generator near the north vehicle bay cycled again, checked itself, and held. Somewhere on the eastern perimeter, a patrol vehicle completed its standard loop and turned back, everything operating as it was supposed to operate, everything on schedule, on record. And somewhere inside all of that normalcy, this woman had been living like a second shadow for 96 hours, and no system had registered her. And no protocol had flagged anything until the precise moment she had decided to let one trace bleed through, to see if he would follow it. He holstered the M4A1. Not because he trusted her, because 28 years of reading situations told him the threat assessment had changed, and a man who could not update his assessment when the facts changed was a man who ended up wrong at the moment that cost him everything. He said, "The supply chain report." She said, "What did you see?" He looked at her for a long moment. He had told this story exactly once, to an inspector general's liaison in a conference room on the second floor of the administrative building on a Tuesday morning in early November. 3 years ago, he had brought documentation. The liaison had taken notes. 2 weeks later, the form letter arrived. He had not spoken about it since. Irregular procurement cycles, he said, requisition patterns that did not match operational requirements, materials logged as consumed with no corresponding output record. The numbers did not reconcile across 6 consecutive quarters. The discrepancy was consistent. She did not write anything down. She listened with the focused attention of someone who already knew what he was going to say and was listening for something beneath the facts, some quality of the man delivering them. "You reported directly to Colonel Spence," she said. "He was my commanding officer. 2 weeks after you filed that report, your promotion packet was suspended." He said nothing. 18 months after that, your second promotion review was declined, without stated explanation. He still said nothing. "In 89 days you retire as a captain," she said, "after a career that long." The perimeter lights held, the cold settled, the base moved through its scheduled rhythms as if none of this were happening inside it. He thought about what he wanted to say. He decided to say nothing because the only things available to him in that moment were bitterness and dignity, and he had spent 3 years maintaining one of them at considerable personal cost. She seemed to understand that. She did not push. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and then I need a decision from you." He waited. "Someone on this installation is selling classified extraction routes," she said, the routing architecture for a Tier 1 asset recovery network. If that material leaves this base in the next 48 hours, 14 people will be dead within 72 hours of the transfer. He kept his face still. The operation I am running carries no official authorization, she continued. My handler is currently unreachable. I have been on this base for 4 days gathering documentation. I have 11 hours remaining before a scheduled transfer window closes. He said, who sent you? She said, does that matter right now? He considered her. He considered the patch on her wrist and the MK13 on her back and the device she had attached to his radio 20 minutes before. He found her and the 96 hours she had spent inside this installation, while the entire security architecture had registered nothing. He said, what do you need? She said, right now, I need you to not contact Colonel Spence. He understood immediately, not gradually, not after working through it. Immediately, because there was only one reason an operator at her level running a ghost mission inside a classified installation would specifically name his commanding officer as the person not to contact, and that reason had been sitting at the edge of his professional life for 3 years like a locked door he had no longer been permitted to open. He said, show me what you have. She pulled a tablet from a sealed pouch on her left side, set to minimum screen brightness, and tilted it toward him. 6 weeks of surveillance. Photographs, timestamp coded, taken from camera angles that required access privileges well above standard clearance. Colonel Ward Spence in his office during hours not logged in any meeting schedule. Spence at the Western Vehicle Gate on 4 consecutive Wednesdays, always between 1730 and 1800, always near a vehicle bearing plates Dillard did not recognize. Spence in the corridor outside the classified communications suite at 3:15. On a Tuesday morning, 2 feet from the door, with no logged authorization. Entry. He studied each image methodically, without letting the weight of what he was seeing collapse his ability to see it clearly. He said, those plates. She said, not registered in any domestic database. He handed the tablet back and straightened, and looked north for a moment. Then back at her. He had been right 3 years ago. He had been right, and he had filed the report, and he had lost 2 promotions, and he had spent 3 years being walked toward the exit, and he had told himself that this was simply how institutions worked sometimes, that honest people filed accurate reports, and sometimes the institution acted and sometimes it did not, that the measure of a man was not whether the institution acknowledged him, but whether he kept doing the job. He had told himself that so many times it had almost started to sound true. She watched him. She did not rush him. He said, 14 people. Yes. He looked at her for a long moment. She was standing in the Montana cold at nearly 4 in the morning, running a mission with no authorization and no backup and a handler she could not reach, asking him to trust an assessment that implicated his commanding officer and dismantled everything comfortable about the professional world. He had 9 weeks left inside. He said, all right. She said, good. She checked the MK13 and settled it. Then she said, stay close and stay quiet. I need to show you something. He followed her south along the motor pool wall. She moved at a pace that was efficient without being hurried, using the available shadows the way. Water moved through a landscape, finding the natural channels without. Appearing to choose them, he matched her and kept his footfalls careful, and tried to track what she was tracking ahead of them. After 40 meters, he understood he was seeing roughly 60% of what she was processing, and the 60% was more than he could have articulated in any briefing he had ever given. She stopped at the corner where the motor pool wall met the outer edge of the equipment staging area. He crouched beside her. She unslung the Mk-13 and settled it against her shoulder with the economy of motion that came from performing this sequence thousands of times until the body stopped making decisions about it. He followed the line of the barrel. 340 yards northeast, the surveillance camera on the corner of the communications annex swept slowly through its standard arc, its infrared lens finding nothing unusual in the frozen dark. She was still for 4 full seconds. Her breathing became so controlled. He could not see it in the cold air. Every element of her focus compressed into a single point of intention, the place where training and experience and will stop being separate things. She fired. The suppressed Mk-13 produced a sound like a door clicking shut in a distant room, nothing more. At 340 yards, the camera housing fractured at the exact lower left corner of its mounting bracket, the precise point where the electrical conduit entered the casing. Camera did not fall. It settled into a permanent new angle, shifted 2 degrees off its standard sweep, opening a coverage gap that would take the base monitoring system 3 hours and 40 minutes to register as an anomaly under normal alert thresholds. He knew the system. He knew that timeline exactly. She had known it well, enough to calculate it in advance. He stared at the camera for a long moment. She was already lowering the rifle, safety engaged, reslung. She looked at him with an expression that was not pride and not invitation, the expression of someone reporting a fact. "We have a lane now," she said. "Sector 3 access corridor." He found his voice. That shot. She was already moving. He followed. They moved north along the staging area boundary, she in front, he 3 steps behind, and the base continued its normal scheduled operations without pause, without alarm. 340 yards away, a surveillance camera holding its new angle and registering nothing. His radio clicked. He stopped walking, reached for it by reflex. Ray Cutter's voice came through, steady and familiar in the way things were familiar after 8 years alongside the same man, Sergeant First Class Ray Cutter. Dillard had trusted him more than anyone else under his command. 8 years working through 2 base rotations and 1 security restructuring, and 1 very long winter that had tested everyone. The man he had recommended for a commendation, reviewed 2 years prior and written the supporting statement for himself. Sir, thermal trace in Sector 6 came back negative. Ran it twice. You want me to notify Colonel Spence directly? The phrasing of that question landed in a specific way. Dillard ran the sentence back through his mind. Not the words, but the structure. The question had not been formed the way a sergeant asked a captain for guidance. It had been formed the way someone asked a question when they already knew the answer they needed and were determining whether the person in front of them was going to be an obstacle to getting it. 8 years. He turned that number over in his mind. She was 5 feet ahead of him and she had stopped walking. She did not turn fully, just looked at him over one shoulder in the way a person looked when they were deciding whether to say the necessary thing or let the other person arrive at it on their own. She said, "Your most trusted man." 3 words, no accusation in them, no satisfaction, delivered the way. A physician stated a diagnosis to a patient who already knew the result, but needed to hear it spoken to make it real. Dillard stood with his hand on the radio. The cold worked through the gap. At his collar, the base lights held their steady amber above the perimeter fence. Cutter's voice waited in the static for an answer that was not going to come. 8 years. He took his hand off the radio. She turned back toward the north and kept walking. He followed. They reached the Sector 3 access corridor entrance at 3:41. She stopped. Fist raised, he stopped behind her. She pulled the tablet and set it to the monitoring grid feed and crouched. He crouched beside her. The screen showed a quadrant map of the base interior: motor pool, armory, communications annex, administrative wing, medical facility. The classified medical wing appeared in the lower left quadrant. He had been inside it twice in 8 years, both times for scheduled compliance. Reviews: sealed room at the far interior corridor, access restricted to Level 4 clearance with documented medical authorization, the kind of room that appeared empty on every administrative roster because that was what the documentation said about it. The thermal overlay showed a reading from inside that room. A clear heat signature, horizontal breathing, the slow measured respiratory pattern of a person who was conscious, conserving energy, and waiting. Someone was in there. Classified medical, sealed room, no scheduled occupancy on any roster. He had legal access to a human being in a room that every document available to him said was empty. He said, "Who was that?" She was looking at the thermal signature with an expression he had not seen on her in the 40 minutes since she had stood up from behind that water tank. The operational steadiness was still present, but beneath it, contained with visible effort, was something specific, not fear, not distress, the careful management of urgency that was costing her something to maintain. She said, "Someone I need to get out alive." The Montana cold pressed down on both of them. The base breathed its normal rhythms. 340 yards away, a surveillance camera held its new angle and registered nothing. Somewhere in the classified medical wing, behind a sealed door in a room that officially contained no one, a person breathed in the dark and waited. Dillard looked at that thermal signature for a long time. Then he looked at her. 89 days, a career that long, one report filed correctly and buried completely, 2 promotions declined without explanation, 1 commanding officer whose name he had not yet said out loud tonight, because saying it out loud would make the shape of all of this completely and permanently clear, and once that happened, there was no position available to him that was not forward. He already knew which way he was going. He said, "What do we do first?" She closed the tablet. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was, for the first time, something close to the recognition between 2 people who have just understood they are in the same fight. She said, "We move." And they did. The Sector 3 access corridor was 68 feet long and 4 feet wide. and it ran between the exterior wall of the communications annex and the inner foundation of the administrative building. No lighting installed. The construction documents listed it as a maintenance access route. The maintenance records showed it had been used 4 times in the past 3 years, twice for routine cable inspection, and twice to route a fiber line. That had been requested and then never fully activated. Gwen Tarrant had known all of this before she ever set foot on the base. She moved through the corridor in near total darkness with the kind of quiet that had nothing to do with effort. It was the physical signature of someone who had spent so many hours in confined darkness that her body had learned to calibrate itself to spaces most people navigated by feel and noise and guesswork. Dillard followed 3 feet behind and matched her pace as closely as he could manage, stepping where she stepped, pausing when she paused, keeping his breathing controlled and his hands away from the walls. She stopped without warning. He stopped. She held up 2 fingers and pointed downward and traced a line across the floor with her fingertip, approximately 18 inches ahead of where his next step would have landed. He looked at the floor. In the dim spill of light from the tablet she had partially shielded against her chest, he could see the faint outline of a pressure sensor mounted flush with the concrete, standard installation. The kind that logged foot traffic without triggering a visible alert, feeding data to the security monitoring system as ambient information. The kind that only mattered if the traffic it registered did not match. A scheduled access window. There was no scheduled access window for this corridor at 341. She stepped over it, clean and precise, her weight transferred forward on the ball of her foot in a motion that pressed nothing against the sensor plate. She moved to the next position and waited. He measured the distance, thought carefully about what she had done, and copied it. His boot cleared the plate with half an inch to spare. He let the air out of his chest slowly and kept moving. The corridor ended at a locked utility door. She had it open in 40 seconds. He watched her hands work the lock mechanism in the dark with the settled confidence of someone who had rehearsed this specific entry point, not as a general skill, but as preparation for this building, this door, this hour. They came through into the lower maintenance level of the administrative building. 1 corridor, concrete walls, overhead pipes running the length of the ceiling. A single yellow safety light at the far end provided just enough illumination to navigate without crossing into camera coverage zones. Gwen crouched against the wall and pulled the tablet. She set it to the security overview and held it low so the glow did not carry. Dillard crouched beside her and studied the screen. The base security grid overlaid the building schematic. 12 active cameras on this floor, 4 guards on rotation, current positions marked in blue. The nearest was 40 feet above them on the first floor, moving away from the north stairwell on a standard patrol arc that would bring him back past the same point in 11 minutes. She did not explain any of this. She simply tilted the screen so he could orient himself, gave him 10 seconds and put it away. He had been running security operations in this building for 3 years. He had reviewed those patrol rotations hundreds of times. She had been inside the base for 4 days, and she knew the rotation down to the minute. The way she moved through that knowledge told him she had not memorized it in the last 4 days. She had memorized it before she arrived. They moved to the north stairwell. His radio stayed silent at his hip after 8 years of ray cutters. Steady voice checking in at regular intervals. The silence carried a weight it had not carried an hour ago. The radio was quiet now, and the quiet had become its own kind of information, filling in spaces where certainty used to live. On the first floor, in an office Dillard had walked past 200 times, Colonel Ward Spence sat behind his desk in the low light of a single lamp and looked at the security monitoring panel mounted in the corner of the room. Spence was 58 years old and had spent 31 of those years learning how institutions worked from the inside, not the version that appeared in regulations and official doctrine, the actual version where information was currency and loyalty was a resource to be managed, and the men who lasted were the men who understood that every system had pressure points, and the only question was who applied them and toward what end. He had built something careful over the past 4 years, patient, layered, designed to operate beneath the threshold of attention. The supply chain irregularities that Dillard had flagged 3 years ago had been an early operational gap, a miscalculation he had since corrected. The report had been managed. The man who filed it had been managed. Everything after that had run without friction. He looked at the sensor anomaly notification from 147. He looked at the 2 negative sweep reports that followed. He looked at the camera feed from the communications annex corner, which had been logging a 2-degree mechanical variance for the past 40 minutes. He picked up his personal cell phone and called Cutter's number. Cutter answered on the second ring. Spence said 3 words and ended the call. Dillard and Gwen reached the first-floor corridor at 3:57. She stopped at the junction and listened for 12 seconds. He counted. Then she moved left toward the secondary operations area where the base intelligence support staff worked day shift and which sat empty at this hour. He heard it before she signaled. Boots, multiple sets, moving with purpose from the direction of the east. Security station, not the measured step of a standard patrol, the faster, deliberate rhythm of people who had been told to look for something specific. She was already moving. She pulled him into a supply alcove off the main corridor, 2 bodies pressed flat against shelving units that smelled of equipment cleaner and cardboard. Through a 6-inch gap in the door he watched 3 of his own personnel move past at a controlled jog. Tactical flashlights forward, radios silent. Radios silent. His people always communicated on radio during a sweep, every time. Protocol required it. Silence on a sweep meant they had been told to move. Without creating a radio traffic record, whoever deployed them did not want the sweep documented. He watched them pass and looked at the back of Gwen's head and said, "Nothing." She waited until the footsteps faded. Then she pulled a compact device from a side pouch, no larger than a matchbox, and held it up for him to see. A localized signal jammer, narrowband, tuned to the base's internal tactical frequency. She had spent 4 days learning exactly how the sweep teams communicated, which bands they used, which channels carried command versus field traffic. She pressed the activation point. The device made no sound. Somewhere in the corridor outside, 3 men on a covert sweep found their tactical radios producing nothing but static. He did not need to see their faces to understand the moment. He had run Enough sweeps himself to know the disorientation of losing comms mid. Operation, the silent looks exchanged, the decision about whether to complete the sweep or abort back to whoever sent them. She leaned close and spoke at a volume that barely qualified as sound. Cutter deployed them 2 minutes ago. They were staged and waiting before we entered the building. The timeline reassembled itself in his mind. Cutter had been ahead of them. Cutter had known or been instructed to have personnel ready before any formal request came through official channels. He let himself sit with that for 3 seconds, the way a man absorbed a physical blow by accepting the weight before getting back on his feet. Then he put it where it needed to go. She already had the secondary operations center open. Inside, recycled air and the quiet warmth of machines that ran continuously through the night. 6 workstations, a facility map on the wall display in its overnight default, a single security camera in the upper corner, indicator light steady green. She sat at the nearest workstation. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with the economy of someone who had navigated this exact sequence before. Possibly in this exact room, possibly more than once in the past 4 days. She pulled up a directory, navigated 3 levels deep without pausing, and opened a file she had already located on a prior visit. She turned the screen toward him. 6 weeks of surveillance photographs, more than what she had shown him. On the tablet outside, a complete documented record. Spence at the Western Vehicle Gate every Wednesday between 1730 and 1800. Always the same. Unregistered vehicle. In 3 of the images, the resolution was high, enough to confirm the plates were identical across all 6 encounters. The same vehicle, the same plates every week, regular as a standing appointment. He looked at the timestamps, Wednesday after Wednesday, 6 consecutive weeks. Whatever Spence was managing through that gate window, it was not ad hoc, it was structural. It was part of a schedule someone had been maintaining with the discipline of a contract. She scrolled to the next folder. Interior surveillance from the classified communications suite. Spence. In the room on 4 separate occasions outside normal working hours. Each visit between 12 and 22 minutes, each time accessing a terminal. That should have generated an automatic notification to the base. Intelligence oversight function. No notifications on record. He said those access events flag automatically. It is a system requirement. She said they flagged. The notifications were intercepted at the routing level before they reached the oversight queue. He looked at her. She said someone with administrative access to the monitoring system cleared them in real time. He ran the list of personnel with that level of access. It was short. He was on it. Cutter was on it. Spence was on it. 2 IT personnel who worked day shift and held insufficient clearance for the communications suite. 3 names, and 2 of those names were already part of this conversation. She scrolled again, this time to something that made him stop breathing. For a moment. Down the hallway, 2 buildings away in the structure Dillard could not see. Spence pressed the phone to his ear and listened. The voice on the other end spoke for 40 seconds. Spence did not write anything down. The message was clean. The transfer window remained on schedule. 48 hours from the current moment, a courier would arrive at the Western Gate during the standard contractor access window. The material needed to be in a specific format, in a specific container. If it was not ready, the arrangement would end permanently, and the consequences of that ending would be, the voice said, asymmetric. Spence said he understood. He ended the call and looked at the monitoring panel. The mechanical variance on the annex camera was still logging. He stared at it. Then he called Cutter again. Expand the sweep, he said. Secondary operations sector. Check all administrative maintenance access points. She had navigated to a different partition of the system. This section showed access logs for the base intelligence support function, the administrative layer managing scheduling, personnel movements, and the document control system. She pulled up a specific user account and filtered by date range. Sergeant First Class Ray Cutter. Dillard read the name at the top of the screen. 47 access events over 4 months. She highlighted the pattern. Cutter's accesses fell consistently during minimum staffing hours. 18 of them occurred on Thursdays, the day after Spence's Wednesday gate meetings. The access files were in one specific category: extraction. Root architecture, the administrative documentation for how the base managed the movement of classified assets. She pulled up a secondary log alongside it, original metadata for the same files. She placed the two columns side by side on the screen. The access timestamps in the primary log and the original file metadata did not match. Someone had altered the records, moved the log timestamps of specific file accesses to Windows when multiple users were simultaneously logged into the system, burying individual access patterns inside the normal noise of shared operations. The alterations were thorough. They were not perfect. She had found them anyway. He said, "How long have you known about Cutter?" She said, "Before I arrived." He processed that. "You knew, and you let me respond to his call when you found me. I needed to see what he would do when he learned you had located me," she said, "and I needed to see what you would do when he called." He understood. He had been observed from the moment she allowed that thermal trace to reach his sensor sweep. Every decision he had made was part of her assessment, not of the tactical situation, of him, whether he was a person she could work with or a person who would become a problem before the 11 hours were up. He said, "And?" She looked at him. "You are here." She stood and crossed to the far side of the room where a standard whiteboard covered most of the wall. Day shift briefing notes partially erased, the ghost of grid lines still faintly visible beneath 2 weeks of accumulated use and incomplete cleaning. She picked up a marker from the tray. He started to say something. She held up one hand without turning around. He stopped. She wrote 2 words on the board, large enough to read across the room. Placed in the corner, where the darker background from the previous partial erase provided the most contrast, she wrote them in the measured, deliberate hand of someone making a declaration. "Still here." She set the marker down in the tray. No sound. He stared at the board. She crossed back to the workstation, sat down, and continued working as though she had simply noted something for later reference, as though 2 words on a whiteboard in a room that an active search team was currently moving toward were not one of the most controlled acts of communication he had ever witnessed. The board said everything that needed saying to whoever walked through That door, to whoever would see it and know, immediately and without further information, that the thing they had been sweeping for had been standing in their house, had written on their wall, and had chosen to let them know. She navigated to a new section of the system, a medical facility administration interface he had not known was accessible. From this workstation, she entered a credential without retrieving it from any device, typed from memory without pause. The classified medical wing roster appeared. The official record showed 0 current occupants, cleared and maintained. Standard overnight status. She opened a layer behind the official record, a shadow log the kind of administrative trace that no system could fully eliminate regardless of how carefully it was managed. Someone had been admitted to the classified medical wing 11 days ago under an emergency medical authorization signed by Spence himself. The admission had been logged in the shadow layer, and the corresponding entry in the official record had been removed. The name on the shadow log admission read, Commander Benjamin Ash, United States Naval Intelligence, emergency admission, nature unspecified, current status stable. Dillard read the name. He said, Ash, your handler. She did not turn from the screen. Yes. He looked at the admission date, 11 days ago. He looked at the authorization signature. He thought about what it meant that Spence had used his own signature to admit a naval intelligence commander to a classified medical facility and then remove the official record. It meant Spence knew exactly who Ash was. It meant Ash had been removed from the operational picture deliberately, not detained by accident, detained to create a specific gap. He said, Ash was managing your mission authorization. Yes. Spence detained him to prevent naval intelligence from responding. Yes. He said, and without Ash your mission had no active sponsor. It was officially canceled. No one knew to send anyone else. She said, no one except me. He held that for a moment. She had come here alone. No authorization, no backup, no official sanction from any body that could protect her if this went wrong, because her handler had been detained and the mission had been canceled and 14 people were going to die in 72 hours and she was the only person who held all 3 of those facts simultaneously. He thought about the 4 days he had spent inside this installation, carrying all of that. She pulled up one final file. She had been moving toward this document through every preceding revelation, building the case the way prosecutor established each supporting fact before presenting the center piece. A routing architecture document, classified at a level he could partially read. The visible sections describe the framework for a Tier 1 asset extraction network covering multiple operational theaters, standardized routing protocols, primary and secondary egress sequences, contact authentication procedures. She scrolled to a section near the middle of the document. A personnel index, 14 entries. Each entry contained a field. Operative's real name, current deployment location, and the specific routing pathway associated with their individual extraction protocol. Real names. He understood immediately and completely what that meant. Operatives working undercover used aliases, false identities, fabricated documentation. Their real names existed in systems like this one for one purpose only, to allow authenticated rescue operations to reach them in the field. The real name was the link between the person living as someone else and the institution, designed to bring them home when it was over. If those names were transferred to an outside party, 14 people, currently living under false identities in operational environments, would become identifiable, not eventually, immediately, and in the environments where these operatives worked. Being identifiable was not a career problem. It was a sentence with a countdown attached. He looked at the list for a long time. He said 3 years ago, the supply chain report. She waited. The procurement irregularities I flagged, he said. The materials logged as consumed with no corresponding output. He looked at her. That was the early infrastructure, before the operation was fully built. I caught the setup phase. She said yes. And Spence buried the report because if I had been allowed to investigate further, I would have found the architecture before it had a buyer. She said before it had value. He looked at the 14 names, 14 people in real locations, trusting a system to protect their identities, trusting that the institution responsible for their safety had not converted them into a product, not knowing that a captain on a base in Montana had tried to stop exactly this 3 years ago and had been methodically removed from any position where he could try again. He had been right. He had filed the correct report. He had done the right thing, and it had not been enough. He straightened and looked at the wall, and then at the door, and then back at her. He said, "Show me the rest." She minimized the file and looked at him for a moment, measuring something other than his willingness. She said, "How long did you serve under Spence?" He said, "First rotation, 9 years ago. He was my battalion commander. After that, 4 years at his current command." She said, "He endorsed your promotion review, both times?" He said, "Yes." She said nothing further. She did not need to. The endorsement letters that preceded the reviews that were then declined, written by a man who already knew the outcome, designed to create the appearance of professional support while a parallel channel ensured the opposite result. He had thanked Spence for those letters. He had shaken his hand and meant it. He had believed for 3 years that Ward Spence was the one person in the upper chain who still saw value in him, who was quietly working on his behalf inside a system that had already decided. He had believed that across 3 years and 2 failed reviews and 89 days of counting down to a retirement he had never wanted. She opened one more folder. He saw the file name, and something in his chest went cold in a way that had nothing to do with Montana. Security camera imagery, date stamp 3 months prior, location, Western Vehicle Gate, exterior approach, 1742 hours. The image showed an unregistered vehicle. Standing beside it was a figure in an army uniform with a captain's rank insignia, profile turned 40 degrees from the camera, face not fully visible, but the build was recognizable. The uniform fit the way his uniform fit. The height was approximately correct. From that angle, in that light, at that camera distance, it looked enough like him that any reviewing officer without specific prior knowledge would assign the face to the name on the access log for that gate window. His name had been logged at that gate at 1742 hours 3 months ago. He had not been at that gate at 1742 hours 3 months ago. He had been in the administrative building, reviewing the monthly security compliance report witnessed by 4 members of his staff. He said this was manufactured. She said yes. He said when? 90 days ago, she said. Inserted into the archive at the access log. Level, the figure in that image is not you. The physical metrics are close enough to generate a false identification under standard review. The access log entry was placed to correspond with the footage timestamp. He looked at the image. He thought about the warrant order he had once glimpsed on Cutter's desk, a document he had assumed was standard administrative work. He thought about the structure of Cutter's question. On the radio, he thought about what an investigating officer would see when reviewing this footage alongside his failure to report through official channels tonight. It would look like a captain 3 months from retirement who had been part of an intelligence compromise and had, when discovery became likely, chosen to assist the operative rather than report her. It had been built to look exactly like that. He had not been kept around as a reliable security officer in his final months of service. He had been kept in place as an available fall position, a name on documentation that could absorb the institutional accountability. When the operation completed and someone needed to carry the weight of it, he said he was going to let me retire, take the pension, walk out clean. She said, as long as you never looked at this room again. He said, and if I had reported you tonight. She said, the warrant Cutter has been holding for 3 months would have been processed within the hour. Your footage would have been the primary exhibit. He stood in the quiet of the operations center and let the complete shape of it settle into him, not as anger, not yet, as information, as the full dimensions of a structure he had been living inside for 3 years without knowing what surrounded him. Ward Spence, his commanding officer, his supposed advocate, the man who had written the endorsement letters and shaken his hand and told him, in 11 minutes in a conference room 3 years ago, that good soldiers knew which hills to die on. He had known, when he said it, exactly which hill he was preparing. The door at the far end of the corridor produced a sound, not a knock, not a code entry, the systematic approach of a search team that had been given a sector and told to clear it room by room, methodical, moving toward this one. Gwen was already on her feet. She closed the tablet, killed the workstation session, and crossed to the secondary exit at the back of the room in 4 steps, no hesitation. She had mapped this exit the same way she had mapped every other route in this building. He followed without being told. They were through the secondary exit and into the stairwell before the far corridor door opened. Voices behind them controlled and low, 3 men. The same rhythm he had heard in the alcove. She was already moving down the stairs. He kept pace and kept quiet. At 4:21, they reached the lower-level access point connecting to the classified medical wing through the underground utility corridor. She stopped at the junction, checked the tablet one final time. The thermal signature in the sealed room was still present, still breathing. She said Ash has limited time in that room. The overnight air management system can be overridden remotely if Spence decides he has become a liability rather than a lever. One command to the facility management system ends the calculation. He said, how long does the reserve air last? She said, 40 minutes from the moment the override is triggered. He looked at the corridor leading toward the medical wing. He looked at her. He understood what she was going to say before she said it. She said, "We have to split up." He started to respond. She continued, "The USB carrying the extraction routes is in the secure vault on sublevel 2. It will transfer to Spence's courier in 46 hours. Without it, we have documentation of intent and conduct, but not the physical evidence. That closes this at the federal level. Ash is the only person outside this building who holds complete documentation of what Spence has done and the authorization to initiate federal action. If we lose Ash, we lose the ability to end this permanently." He understood the arithmetic. He did not like what it required, but understanding and preference had stopped being the same thing somewhere. Around the hour he spent following her through the Montana dark. She said, "Go get Ash. I will get the USB." He said, "If Spence triggers the facility override." She said, "Then move fast." He looked at her for a moment. She met his eyes, and in them he saw nothing that resembled false comfort. What he saw instead was the specific quality of someone who had calculated every probable outcome and had decided that the acceptable ones required both of them in motion simultaneously, and that the remaining uncertainty was a factor they both already understood. He turned toward the medical wing corridor. Behind him, her footsteps moved in the opposite direction without a sound. The base held its nighttime operations. The perimeter lights burned steady. Somewhere in the facility, 3 men completed their sweep of a room and found a whiteboard with 2 words written in one corner, "Somewhere above." Sublevel 2, the secure vault ran its overnight security cycle. Inside it sat a transfer container that held the names of 14 people who had no idea what was happening inside a building in rural Montana at 4:20 in the morning. The lockdown alarm triggered at 4:23. Not the graduated advisory tier, not the preliminary alert, the full red designation, base-wide, immediate, every electronically controlled door in the installation engaging its lock in sequence, every external communication line switching to encrypted emergency band, every security camera cycling to a 2-second refresh rate. Under the lockdown protocol, the secure vault on sublevel 2 would initiate its final automated seal sequence. It would complete in 22 minutes. His radio picked up nothing. The lockdown automated broadcast ran on the encrypted emergency band, a separate system from the tactical frequency. His standard security radio was set to receive, without routing through the operations center terminal. The broadcast could not reach him. But he did not need the broadcast. The sound of every door lock in the corridor ahead of him engaging in sequence, one after another down the entire length of the hall, told him everything. He broke into a run. Behind him, 2 levels up and moving in the opposite direction, Gwen Tarrant ran toward a sealed vault that would complete its final automated lock in 22 minutes. In the classified medical wing, in a sealed room that no official record acknowledged, Commander Benjamin Ash breathed in the dark. The ventilation had just been remotely overridden. 40 minutes of reserve air, possibly less, depending on his respiration rate under stress. The clock in Dillard's chest was already running. He did not stop. He ran. Not the controlled pace of a security response, or the measured stride of a man managing his endurance over distance. He ran the way a man ran when the arithmetic was simple and the margin was absolute, when the distance between where he stood and where he needed to be was the only variable in the world that still mattered. The corridor to the classified medical wing was 312 feet long. He knew that because he had walked it twice in 8 years and noted the measurement the way he noted things he suspected might one day need to be known precisely. The lockdown had sealed every electronic door in the installation simultaneously. 3 controlled access points stood between the main administrative corridor and the medical wing entrance, each requiring either a hard bypass from the security panel or a manual override that would consume time. The reserve air in that sealed room was already consuming for him. He had the override codes for the first 2. The third required a level 4 medical authorization he did not carry. He ran and did not think about the third door yet. The first 2 were ahead and the clock was running, and the only productive action available in this moment was speed. The overhead lights had shifted to amber under the lockdown protocol. The corridor stretched long and empty in that flat amber wash, sealed doors in sequence down its full length, the sound of every lock having engaged still faintly resonant in the walls. He had heard that sound exactly once before in a training exercise 7 years ago, and had never expected to hear it in a situation where his own radio could not reach the automated emergency broadcast, and one of his own men had been deployed against him. He reached the first access door at a run and entered the override code. Without fully stopping, the lock released in 2 seconds. He pushed through and kept moving. At the second door he was breathing harder, 52 years old and decades of accumulated where that showed itself in moments exactly like this one, when the body was asked to perform at a level the mind remembered better than the muscles did. He entered the second code. The lock released. He went through. The third door was 40 feet ahead. He stopped in front of it and read the panel. Level 4 medical authorization. Biometric confirmation required. No override code in his sequence applied to this door. He looked at the panel for 2 seconds. Then he looked at the door frame. Standard construction, reinforced but not vault grade. The electronic lock engaged a primary bolt driving into a steel catch welded into the frame. The frame itself was original to the building, installed in a construction phase that predated the security upgrade by 11 years. The weld points on the catch were on the interior side. The frame was the weakest point in the assembly. He stepped back 2 feet and drove his right shoulder into the door at the frame edge below the lock housing, where the original construction was oldest. The door held on the first impact. He hit it again in the same spot, putting his full weight and momentum into the lower frame, and on the third impact the catch gave with a sharp metallic report, and the door swung inward. His shoulder filed its complaint. He went through. The classified medical wing ran a corridor of 6 rooms, 4 standard examination spaces and 2 sealed treatment rooms at the far end. Amber emergency lighting in the corridor, steady and flat. He moved fast, checking each room as he passed. Empty, empty, empty. The fourth room held medical equipment running on emergency power, monitors cycling through automated checks. No one inside. The fifth door was sealed. He pressed his palm flat against the door surface and listened. Slow measured breathing on the other side, the specific pattern of a trained person managing oxygen consumption under restricted conditions. He said, Ash. A pause, then a voice, controlled but carrying 11 days of confinement. Around its edges, who is that? He said, Captain Frank Dillard, Fort Aldrin Security. A longer pause, Tarrant sent you. He said she went for the vault. A brief silence. Then, the door has a manual release on the exterior. Panel bottom housing, red lever. He found it, a red emergency release lever below the electronic panel. The kind of override required by medical facility codes for exactly this situation. He pulled it, the door unlocked with a pressurized hiss and swung outward. Commander Benjamin Ash was sitting upright on the examination table. Not lying down, 55 years old, the build of a man who had maintained himself through a career that required it, but 11 days in that room had left visible marks. The examination light had been switched off and he had been sitting in the dark before the amber emergency light reached. Under the door gap, his wrists carried the faint marks of restraints. Recently removed, he had worked himself free at some point in the proceeding. Hours and had been sitting in the dark, loose and waiting, giving no one outside any indication that the situation inside had changed. Dillard looked at him. Ash looked back. Dillard said, Can you walk? Yes, Ash said. He came off the table and stood and did not waver. I have been ready to walk since day 3. They moved 2 levels below them and 2 corridors west, in the utility tunnel. Running beneath the sublevel mechanical systems, Gwen Tarrant moved through complete darkness at a pace that would have been impossible for anyone who had not spent 4 days memorizing the exact spatial dimensions of every passage in this installation. The utility tunnel was 41 inches wide and 6 feet 2 inches high, and ran for 93 feet from the mechanical room access point to the junction beneath sublevel 2. No thermal equipment, no map. She carried the blueprint she had studied 4 days ago in a session lasting 2 hours and 40 minutes, carried them in the way that mattered in the part of her mind that had been tested and trained over a career. Beginning at age 22, assessed then as statistically exceptional, and refined over 20 years into something closer to absolute recall. She moved through the dark, counted her steps, and knew exactly where she was. The utility junction opened into a maintenance access point directly below the sublevel 2 corridor leading to the secure vault. She found the access hatch by feel, identified the release mechanism in the dark by its position relative to the junction corner, and opened it without sound. She came up into the sublevel 2 corridor from below. The lockdown had sealed the vault's primary access door, a 4-inch steel composite panel with a biometric and code entry system, rated for exactly this kind of security event. Under lockdown protocol, the vault's automated seal sequence had a fixed completion window. She had entered the corridor with approximately 14 minutes remaining. She did not approach the primary access door. She moved to the service panel mounted 18 inches to its right. The panel covered the climate control and power management connections for the vault's interior environment, not part of the primary security architecture, an HVAC access point rated for maintenance personnel, covered by a standard tool key that she had duplicated on day 2 of her time inside the installation. She opened the service panel. The vault's security design had been built by people who thought in terms of the primary door, because the primary door was where threats were expected to arrive. The service panel required physical presence in a corridor that the primary controls were supposed to prevent unauthorized personnel from reaching. The logic was circular. Circular logic always had a gap. She found the gap. Inside the service panel, the vault's internal power management connected to the building's main supply, alongside the physical bolt control for the secondary locking mechanism, the mechanical backup that engaged when electronic systems failed. The secondary bolt ran on a dedicated circuit that could be isolated independently. She isolated it. The secondary bolt disengaged. The vault retained its primary electronic lock, but the door now had one locking mechanism instead of two, and the primary electronic lock carried an emergency release protocol required by safety codes for situations where personnel were accidentally sealed inside. She found the emergency release override inside the service panel. She opened the vault in 4 minutes and 17 seconds from the moment she had surfaced from the access hatch. Her hands were steady throughout. Inside, on the second shelf at the rear, a sealed transfer container held a USB drive in a protective case. She confirmed the identification markings, confirmed case integrity, and secured it in the sealed pouch on her chest. Rig. She turned back toward the access hatch. She stopped. The vault's internal log terminal was mounted on the left wall, active on emergency power, running its automated record cycle. She looked at the access log on the screen, every entry and action recorded in this vault over the past 60 days. Her eyes found the name Commander Benjamin Ash, a vault access event logged 37 days ago, not documented in any of the surveillance files she had been working from, not a visit she had known about. Ash had been in this vault more than a month before his detention, and the event survived here in the vault's isolated internal record, which Spence had not cleared because clearing it would have required a vault access that generated its own log entry in the same record he was trying to sanitize. She looked at the timestamp, the nature of the access, the specific files Ash had reviewed during that visit. He had known, 37 days before she arrived, Ash had come to this vault himself and reviewed the extraction route architecture. He had stood in this room and confirmed what Spence was building. He had looked at the same list of 14 names she had looked at hours ago, and then he had gone back to work on the case, and 11 days later he was placed in a sealed room before he could complete it. She stood in the vault and thought about 11 days in a sealed room, with the full knowledge of what you had found and no ability to act on it, a man who kept working until the moment he was physically prevented from continuing, and then sat in the dark and waited. She thought about Fort Bragg, 4 years into her time working under Ash's direction, after an operation that had run 3 weeks past its projected timeline because she had refused to leave a forward position until the last asset in her recovery sequence was confirmed safe. He had looked at her across the debriefing table without frustration, with the measured acknowledgement of someone who understood exactly why she had made that choice. He had said, the mission ends when the last asset is safe, not before. Not ever before. She had told him it was a good way to get people killed by staying in. The field passed the optimal extraction window. He had agreed. He had said, it is also the only way to do this work and still recognize yourself at the end of it. She closed the vault log terminal. She secured the USB. She moved back to the access hatch, dropped into the utility tunnel and moved east through the sublevel maintenance corridor. At the main building junction, she took the North Passage 2 corridors to the administrative wing connection point, then followed the interior route toward the medical facility. She had mapped this path 4 days ago. She followed it without hesitation. The mission ends when the last asset is safe. They met in the corridor outside the med wing at 4:51, Dillard moving fast with Ash one step behind, Ash's gait steady if not fully fluid. She came from the opposite direction at the same pace, and they converged at the junction without ceremony. She looked at Ash for 1 second, confirming his condition and mobility. Then she looked at Dillard. She said, USB secured. He said, he can move. She said, then we move. Ash said, Ward. Both of them looked at him. He said, he will not go to the vault. He will not attempt to recover the USB or contest this inside the facility. He has encountered situations approximating this before, not exactly this but close enough. He paused to breathe. He will go to his contingency exit, east side of the administrative building, sublevel parking, the vehicle gate to the contractor lot. He has used it twice in the past year when he needed to leave the base without a gate log entry. She said, you have been tracking his movements since before you sent me here. Yes, Ash said. She nodded once. She looked at Dillard. He said, I know where that exit is. She said, tell me how he operates under direct pressure, his training. Background. Dillard said, 15 years commanding intelligence operations. Before that, he ran a SEER program for 3 years. Survival, evasion, resistance. Escape Fort Huachuca. She said, I know. He looked at her. She said, I was in his program 15 years ago, 6 weeks. He processed that. She said, he is methodical under pressure up to the moment he believes the primary threat has been neutralized. After that, he moves to his exit. Without protecting his rear approach, he spent 3 years training people to evade. He was never trained to be the one being hunted. He has never expected to need that skill, and untrained instincts under pressure are predictable. Dillard said, you designed your approach around his psychological profile. She said, I designed my approach around this operation. His profile is part of it. He understood the distinction. She had not come here because of Spence. She had come here because of 14 names on a list. Spence was an obstacle between her and those 14 people, and she had studied that obstacle the way she studied every obstacle, completely in advance before the moment required it. She said, the east parking exit, time from here. He said, 4 minutes at a run, 3 through the lower equipment bay. She said 3. They ran. The lower equipment bay was a wide concrete floor used for vehicle maintenance and equipment storage, currently holding 6 base vehicles in various stages of service rotation. The amber emergency lighting cast long shadows across the vehicle hoods. Their footsteps were the only sound in the space. She moved ahead at the far end, shifting from a run into the controlled deliberateness of someone approaching a position. She held up one hand. They stopped. She stood at the bay entrance leading to the east parking corridor and listened for 3 seconds. She said, low and even, 2 personnel ahead. 1 armed guard at the vehicle gate. 1 additional figure near the gate. Control panel. Dillard said, I only have authority over one of them. She said, you have authority over both. You are the security commander of this installation. The lockdown Spence triggered transferred complete security authority to you for the duration of the event under base. Operational protocol. He handed you the mechanism. He thought about that for 2 seconds. Ward Spence had activated the system that gave Frank Dillard formal command. Authority over every person on Fort Aldrin. He almost said something about the particular quality of that. He decided it could wait. They came through the equipment bay entrance into the east parking corridor. He saw them immediately. Specialist Chen stood at the vehicle gate with the attentive posture of someone following lockdown protocol as trained, 24 years old. 2 years at this post, reliable in the way young soldiers were reliable. When someone had taken the time to teach them properly. The second figure stood at the gate control panel with a personal bag over one shoulder and a document folder under his arm. Colonel Ward Spence turned when he heard their footsteps. For one moment all 4 of them were still. The amber light lay flat. Shadows across the corridor. The vehicle gate was sealed by the lockdown. Spence looked at Dillard. He looked at Gwen. He looked at Ash. He processed that sequence in order, and his face did the thing a controlled man's face did when a controlled calculation met a result it had not included. He looked back at Dillard. He said, Frank. Dillard said, Ward. Spence looked at the document folder under his arm. He held it toward Dillard, not as a threat, not as surrender, as an offer, the same offer he had framed in the corridor 2 hours ago, which he had apparently been holding in prepared form for 3 years, waiting for exactly this contingency. He said, put that down and walk away from this. I can still make the promotion happen, Lieutenant Colonel, before you retire. The paperwork is already signed. Dillard looked at the folder. He thought about 11 minutes in a conference room 3 years ago. He thought about 2 endorsement letters written by a man who already knew they would not succeed. He thought about 8 years standing next to Ray Cutter and the 47 access events in the intelligence support system and the shadow log admission, and 14 people in operational environments who had trusted an institution that had been quietly converted into a mechanism designed to get them killed. He thought about 2 words on a whiteboard in an empty room. He said, the right hill, Ward. He said it the way Spence had said it to him 3 years ago, with the same even tone, in the same register. He said it so that the man who had coined it would understand exactly what was being returned to him and from which direction. Spence held the folder for a moment. Then he set it on the gate control panel and reached inside his jacket. Gwen moved. She crossed the distance in 3 strides, and what happened in the next 4 seconds was not a fight in any meaningful sense of the word. It was the demonstration of a gap between a man who had spent 30 years managing systems and a person who had spent 20 years in the field. under conditions system managers never encountered. She controlled his reach before it completed, redirected his weight, and had him against the gate with his arm locked and his balance removed before Specialist Chen had fully processed what he was seeing. Spence's personal weapon hit the concrete. He did not resist after that. He stood against the vehicle gate with his arm held at an angle that made resistance a physical calculation with only one outcome, and he breathed in the amber light and he said nothing. Dillard retrieved the weapon from the floor. He looked at Chen. He said, "Specialist Chen, detain Colonel Spence under base lockdown. Authority pending federal investigation. Do you understand those orders?" Chen was 24 years old, and nothing in his training had prepared him for this specific configuration of events. He looked at Dillard. He looked at the colonel held against the gate. He looked back at Dillard. Then he reached for his restraints. He said, "Yes, sir." Footsteps behind them, they all turned. Ray Cutter had not followed orders. He had followed Spence. When the lockdown triggered, Cutter had seen the direction it was coming. Not from any outside threat, from the man who had given him his instructions for 4 months. He had understood in the way operationally. Experienced people understood things without being told, that Spence was moving toward his exit, and that the end of the operation was arriving. Whether he was ready for it or not, he had made a decision. He had stopped following orders and started following the man who gave them, because he needed to see where this ended before he decided which side of it he was standing on. He came through the equipment bay entrance at a walk, not a run, alone. A tablet in his hand, sidearm holstered, moving at the measured pace of a man who had made a decision before he arrived and was not reconsidering it. He stopped 15 feet away and looked at the scene in front of him. Spence against the gate, Chen applying restraints, Dillard holding the confiscated weapon, Gwen 3 feet from Spence, hands at her sides. Ash against the wall, standing upright, looking like a man who had spent 11 days in a sealed room and had decided that the appropriate response to being free was to remain on his feet. Cutter looked at each of them in sequence. He looked last at Dillard. He said, "Sir." Dillard said nothing. Cutter held up the tablet. The screen was visible in the amber light. He had accessed the extraction root architecture file from the intelligence support system, the same file, the personnel index on the screen, 14. Entries, real names, current positions. He had found it himself in the system he had spent 4 months helping to conceal. He said, "Name 7 on this list." He said it quietly, the way a man stated a fact he needed to speak aloud in order to hear it with his own ears. Staff Sergeant Derek Holt, former 75th Ranger Regiment, we deployed together in 2014. A pause. He is currently listed as operating under a civilian cover identity in a country whose government would execute him if his real name were confirmed. The parking corridor was very quiet. Cutter set the tablet on the hood of the nearest vehicle. He unholstered his sidearm and placed it beside the tablet with the deliberate care of someone setting something down for the last time. He reached to his belt and removed his own restraints, the standard issue pair he had been carrying for 3 years as part of his duty kit. He walked to the drainage pipe running along the base of the corridor wall. He sat down next to it. He put one cuff around the pipe and one cuff around his wrist and locked both. He looked at Dillard. He said, "I did not know about the list. I want that on record." Dillard looked at him for a long time. He thought about 8 years. He thought about what it meant to be asked to do something by a person you trusted and to tell yourself it was loyalty and to follow that telling. All the way to parking corridor at 5 in the morning where the man you had served alongside for a decade was sitting on a concrete floor with his own restraints on his own wrist, answering for something no one had compelled him to answer for. He said, "It will be on record." Cutter nodded once. He looked at the floor and stayed where he was. Specialist Chen finished restraining Spence and stepped back. Spence stood against the vehicle gate in the amber light and looked at the document folder sitting on the gate control panel. He did not speak again. Gwen crossed to Ash and assessed his condition with quiet efficiency. The clinical check of someone confirming a person's status after extended confinement. She said something to him too low for Dillard to hear. He responded. She nodded and seemed satisfied with what she heard. Then she turned to Dillard. She said, "I need a secure line to naval intelligence. Ash can authorize the federal response from there." He said, "Security Operations Center, main level, line 3 is a hardwired secure channel. It does not route through the base communication network." She said, "Will it function under lockdown conditions?" He said, "It was designed to function under lockdown. It was the one infrastructure upgrade I pushed through when I was given this assignment." She looked at him for a moment. Something in her expression shifted. Almost imperceptibly, the way the quality of light shifted slightly before the angle of it changed. She said, "That was good work, Captain." He looked at her. He thought about the months spent advancing that upgrade. Through 3 separate budget requests, the 2 procurement reviews, the single final approval that came through only because he had navigated around one level of the chain to submit it correctly. He had done it because the existing secure communication architecture had a gap, and the gap was a vulnerability the base could not afford. He had done it because doing the job correctly was the one thing that remained available to him after everything else had been taken, and he had held on to it. He said yes. They moved to the Security Operations Center with Ash between them. The lockdown was still active. The base was still sealed. In the east parking corridor, Cutter sat against a drainage pipe and waited for what came next. Spence stood in the care of a 24-year-old specialist. The secure vault on sublevel 2 held an empty space where a transfer container had been. Ash made the call from line 3. The response from Naval Intelligence came in 4 minutes. By 6:30 hours, federal jurisdiction had been formally established over Fort Aldrin. By 7:15, the first federal response team was 90 minutes out by air. By 7:30, the base lockdown had been lifted under federal authority and replaced with an evidence preservation order covering the entire installation. Dillard stood in the Security Operations Center and watched it happen. He did not have a particular way to describe what he felt. It was not triumph, it was not relief in any clean form. It was the specific sensation of a pressure that had been present so long it had started to feel like part of the normal weight of existing, suddenly absent, and the absence itself requiring some time to register fully. Gwen completed a debrief with Ash that lasted 40 minutes. Dillard was present for the portions requiring his direct testimony and excused from the portions involving operational details above his clearance. He understood that division and did not object to it. When it was over, and Ash had been transferred to the medical response team that arrived with the first federal vehicle, Gwen stood in the corridor outside the Security Operations Center and conducted her final equipment check with the systematic attention she gave everything. She was preparing to leave. He walked out into the corridor. She looked at him. He said, "There is a commendation letter." She said nothing. He said, "Ash told me, in the med wing while we were waiting for you." He said a letter had been written the day after I filed the supply chain report. He had documented his assessment that my filing was accurate and strategically significant and had initiated a formal commendation. It was intercepted by Spence before it reached my file. She held his gaze. He said he kept the original. She reached into a document pouch on her left side and removed a sealed envelope. She held it toward him. He took it. It was a standard military correspondence envelope, sealed, worn slightly at the corners in the way things became worn when carried for a long time. In a field pouch through weather and operations and years of forward motion. His name was on the front, no rank, just his name, which was how Ash had chosen to address it, as though the rank had never been the point. He opened it. The letter was dated 3 years ago, 2 days after he had submitted the supply chain report, written on naval intelligence letterhead, precise and formal. It described the specific nature of what he had observed, the accuracy of his documentation, and the professional judgment required to submit a formal report against a commanding officer without supporting corroboration from any other source. The closing paragraph read, "Captain Dillard's action represents the standard of conduct this institution depends upon and frequently fails to honor. It is recommended that this commendation be placed in his permanent file and that his promotion review be reopened for full consideration at the earliest practicable date." He read it twice. He folded it carefully along its original crease lines and returned it to the envelope and held it in both hands for a moment. He looked at Gwen. She said, "Some things take time to reach the right desk." He said, 3 years. She said, "Yes." He stood in the corridor of Fort Aldrin with a letter in his hands that had been written 3 years ago and intercepted and carried in a naval intelligence commander's field pouch through 11 days of confinement in a sealed room, and had arrived, finally, at the place it had always been addressed to. He had been right. He had been right 3 years ago and on every day since. The knowing had been enough to keep going, but it had never been enough to remove the specific weight of being told, in every way an institution could tell a man without saying it plainly, that he was not. The weight was gone now. He stood without it and felt the full difference. He said, "What happens to Cutter?" She said, "That is a federal determination, not mine to make." He said, "He came forward voluntarily. He sat down without being asked." She said, "I know." A pause. "That will count." He nodded. Outside the building, through the windows at the end of the corridor, the Montana sky had begun to change. The flat black of the deep hours was giving way to the first gray suggestion of a horizon, the thin line of approaching light that appeared before the actual light, the announcement Before the thing itself, he watched it for a moment. He said, "Where do you go from here?" She was already running her final inventory, the systematic check of someone who had ended operations this way for 20 years. She did not look up when he asked. She said, "Forward." He almost asked what that meant. He decided it meant exactly what it sounded like. He said, "Tarot." She looked at him. He said, "You came here alone. No authorization, no backup, because 14 people needed someone too." She looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone deciding how to respond to a statement that was accurate but that did not require acknowledgement. She said, "You followed a thermal trace for 6 hours on a base where nothing ever happens, alone, 3 months before you retired because something told you to." He said, "A career's worth of instinct." She said, "Yes." She settled the MK-13 across her back. "That is the same thing." She walked toward the building exit. He watched her go. Her pace was exactly what it had been at 2 in the morning in the motor pool, measured and purposeful, each step the product of a continuous calculation that never stopped running. No ceremony in it. No performance. She moved the way she did everything as though the action were simply what came next, and the only question worth asking was what came after that. She pushed through the exterior door. The gray morning light came through the opening for a moment. The door swung closed behind her. He stood in the corridor with the letter in both hands and 88 days left in the United States Army. 88 days. He turned that number over. It had the same shape. It always had the same finality, but it felt different now the way the same room felt different depending on what you understood about it when you walked in. He had filed the correct report. He had made the correct call in every moment that had mattered tonight. He had done the right thing across 3 years when doing the right thing had cost him everything it was going to cost him, and there had never been a guarantee that any of it would be recognized, and it had been recognized anyway by a man in a sealed room who had carried the letter for 3 years because he believed in the day it would reach the right desk. That was worth something. That was worth more than a rank. Outside in the gray Montana morning, Gwen Tarrant walked across the open ground toward the perimeter fence. The cold was the same cold it had been at 2 in the morning. The base was coming awake around its edges, vehicles beginning to move on the access roads, the first daylight shift personnel appearing at building entrances and looking at the federal vehicles near the administrative building with the uncertain expressions of people who had arrived for an ordinary workday and found the ordinary had been replaced by something they would spend years trying to fully understand. She crossed the open ground, and when she reached the perimeter gate the federal authority had opened at 7:30. She passed through it without breaking stride. A radio transmission crackled from the device at her shoulder. Coordinates, a location designation, a time reference placing the next operational window at 18 hours from the current moment. She pressed the transmit and said, "Copy." She said it without breaking stride, without looking back, without any of the pause other people might have attached to a morning that, by any reasonable measure, warranted at least a moment of stillness. She had done what she came to do. 14 names were still on a list in a vault, and that list was no longer in the hands of the man who had intended to sell it. Ash was out of the sealed room. The evidence was secured. The federal response was in motion. The mission was complete. The next one was already in motion. She walked across the frozen Montana ground toward the eastern ridge as the gray horizon separated itself from the gray sky, and the first actual light appeared above the tree line, not warm yet, not by a long way, but undeniable for anyone paying attention to the right part of the distance. Inside the building, Frank Dillard watched through the corridor window until she reached the perimeter fence and passed through the gate and continued walking into the pre-dawn without slowing, without looking back. Already somewhere in the calculation of what came next. He did not see which direction she turned after the fence. By the time he thought to look more carefully, she was already gone. He looked at the letter in his hands for a long moment, then he folded it once, placed it in his inside breast pocket, directly over his chest, and walked to the Security Operations Center to begin the formal documentation required, in triplicate and under federal oversight, of everything that had occurred at Fort Aldrin between 1:47 and 7:30 on a February morning in Montana. He had 88 days left. He intended to use every one of them exactly the right way.